My parents cut me off years ago. Now they're trying to reconnect, and it's worse than ever. Living in my parents' house felt like walking on eggshells every single day. Growing up, I quickly learned that every little thing I did was under a microscope. My dad? The man had this weird obsession with control. He'd tell me what to wear, where to go, and who I could talk to, and he didn't care how ridiculous his rules sounded. If he decided something was bad, it was bad, and I'd better go along with it unless I wanted a huge argument. Or worse, punishment. Now, my mom, she's a whole other story. She wasn't exactly evil like him, but she might as well have been because she never stood up for me. Not once. Whatever my dad said, she just nodded along with it. She'd always tell me that he knew best, and that I should just do what he wanted. She'd throw in a quick, "It's for your own good," and that was supposed to be the end of it. The thing is, it wasn't for my own good at all. It was just him being on a power trip and her not wanting to rock the boat. One time I was about 14 and there was this girl in my class who I'd been hanging out with more. We'd talk during lunch, walk to classes together, normal friendship stuff. Well, my dad caught wind of it and somehow twisted it in his head to mean I was dating her or planning to date her or whatever other crazy ideas he had. So, he sat me down with that serious look he always had and started in with all this nonsense about how I'd better not be messing around. When I tried to explain that we were just friends, he got even angrier, saying he knew exactly what kids my age were up to. Honestly, I was scared. He went on, saying that if I even thought about having a relationship, he'd make sure I regretted it. It was more than just yelling, though. He was dead serious. I didn't feel like I could even defend myself, so I just sat there, silent, waiting for him to finish. And then, right on cue, my mom came in, not to calm him down, but to add to the shame. She looked me up and down and told me that I was too young to be acting that way, and that I was bringing shame to the family. Yeah, shame. For having a friend. That was the kind of twisted logic I was dealing with. That incident was a turning point for me. I remember going to my room afterward, trying to hold it together and thinking, I've got to get out of here someday. That's when I started counting down the years until I could legally leave, counting every birthday and milestone as one step closer to freedom. It wasn't like I was just a kid getting grounded or being told to do my chores. This was actual intimidation and control. They were so obsessed with keeping me in line that I felt like I had zero say over my own life. Another thing with my dad was how he acted like he was some kind of detective, always watching. He'd randomly go through my stuff, looking for any hint that I was breaking his rules. I couldn't even leave a school notebook out without him going through it, pretending he was just checking my work. And if he found something he didn't like, well, that was a whole other lecture waiting for me. He even had a rule that I couldn't go to any friend's house, ever, because in his words, people can't be trusted. But he could have friends over whenever he felt like it. His friends would come by, drink coffee in the kitchen, and they'd all sit around talking like they owned the place. Meanwhile, if I even asked to go hang out at the mall with my friends, it was too dangerous. I'd be tempted to do something wrong. Like, how paranoid do you have to be to think a kid going to the mall is asking for trouble? Going to a simple event? Like a friend's birthday party? Forget about it. My classmates would talk about the parties they went to, and I'd have to make up some excuse about why I couldn't go. I couldn't tell them my dad had some ironclad rule about not letting me leave the house for social events. I wasn't even allowed to go to school functions like the dance or sports games. Everyone thought I was just the weird kid who didn't go out, but they had no idea that it was because my dad was running some kind of control experiment on me. My mom, she'd just say, "You know how your dad is?" As if that explained everything. To her, his rules were law, and it was my job to follow them, no questions asked. If I ever pushed back or tried to ask why he was like this, she'd say, "Don't upset him, it's not worth it." Looking back, I think she was honestly afraid of him too, but that didn't make it any easier on me. She chose to stand by him instead of protecting me or even questioning his ridiculous rules. So there I was, stuck in a house where everything I did was monitored, controlled, or shut down completely. At school, I'd see other kids getting excited about growing up, getting their first phones, going to sleepovers, stuff like that. For me, none of that was allowed. If I even brought up wanting a phone, my dad would go on this whole rant about how I didn't need one, and if I was meant to have one, he'd let me know. He seriously saw my independence as a threat. I can't even explain how isolating it felt. I was the only one I knew who couldn't even go out after school without getting questioned like I'd committed a crime. Sometimes I'd stay late at school just to get a bit of peace, telling my parents it was for extra study so I wouldn't get in trouble. I remember feeling a weird mix of relief and dread, knowing I'd have to go back home and deal with whatever new rule my dad had cooked up that day. It was like living in a prison where the guards were my own parents. and there was no escape. By the time I was a few years away from turning 18, I'd had enough. I knew that, as soon as I was legally allowed to make my own decisions, I'd be out of there, no looking back. I kept my head down, didn't argue, just did what I had to do to avoid more conflict. In my mind, I was already counting down the months, the weeks, waiting for the day I could walk out without their permission. I wasn't just looking for a way out, I was preparing for it. I'd watch how other people handled things, took mental notes on how to deal with life, so I'd be ready. My dad had made it clear he wasn't going to help me with anything, so I was on my own, and I had to figure it all out myself. That was my life, waiting, surviving, and planning for the day I could finally leave and never look back. When I finally got a part-time job in high school, I thought things might change for me. It was a grocery store down the street from school. Nothing glamorous, just stocking shelves, cleaning up, ringing up customers. But it was my own gig. The manager seemed decent, the hours worked around my school schedule, and I was excited. I was 16, and this job felt like the first real thing I'd ever had to myself. The idea of making my own money, something I could actually control, was the only freedom I'd had in years. But of course, the second my dad found out, that freedom got yanked away before I even got my first paycheck. I remember the day he asked me about it. He had this way of asking questions where it was less of a question and more of a setup. Like, he'd wait for me to answer, just so he could jump in and make me feel like I was in the wrong somehow. So he's sitting at the kitchen table and he goes, "So I heard you got yourself a job?" I should have known right then that this wasn't going to end well, but I was too naive, thinking he'd actually be proud of me or something. So I told him all about it, expecting maybe even a good job or at least a nod. Instead, he hits me with, "Well, I hope you're planning on contributing to the household." Contributing to the household. That was his way of saying he expected me to hand over every cent I made. I tried to explain that I wanted to save up for college and maybe even a little bit for myself, but he wasn't having it. He actually laughed, like the idea of me keeping my own paycheck was some kind of joke. He said, "As long as you live under my roof, everything you earn goes to this family." To him, me living there automatically meant I owed him everything I had. When I finally got that first paycheck, I remember holding it in my hand and feeling this weird mix of pride and dread. On one hand, I'd earned it myself. On the other, I knew it wasn't really mine. And sure enough, the minute I walked in the door, my dad was there, hand out, waiting to take it. No questions, no discussion, just an expectation that I'd fork it over. What was I going to do? I didn't want to end up on the street, so I handed it over. But man, I was angry. I worked hard, like really hard, and I was still being treated like a kid with no say in my life. My dad would make these comments about how he was teaching me responsibility, but all I was learning was that I was just a walking wallet to him. My mom, of course, backed him up. She'd say things like, "Your dad knows best," or "We're a family, we all pitch in." But I knew it wasn't about the family, it was about control. If they really cared about helping me or teaching me anything, they'd at least let me save something. But no, every cent went straight to them. I even tried asking if I could keep just a little, but my dad would shut me down, saying it was selfish to keep money when the family needed it. Needed it? They were fine. There were no emergencies, no special needs, just him taking my money for the sake of it. He even tried to make it seem like he was doing me a favor by letting me stay there while I worked. Like somehow living at home meant I owed him my entire paycheck. I'd see my friends from work talking about the things they were saving up for. One was buying a car, another had plans for a trip. And here I was, handing over every dollar, not even able to buy myself a snack without asking for permission. There was this one time I got a small raise. It wasn't anything huge, just a few extra bucks an hour, but to me it was a big deal. I didn't even tell my parents because I knew it wouldn't make a difference to them, but my dad found out anyway, somehow. He was always snooping, going through my stuff, even reading my pay stubs if I left them out by accident. So when he saw that I was making a little extra, he went on this whole speech about how lucky I was to be able to contribute more. He actually expected me to be grateful that he was taking my raise, like it was some privilege. The worst part was, anytime I'd bring up wanting to save or needing money for something, he'd guilt trip me. He'd go, "Oh, so you think you don't need this family anymore? You think you can just do whatever you want?" It was the ultimate manipulation. He'd twist everything to make it seem like I was being selfish for wanting a little independence, as if keeping even a single dollar for myself was some huge betrayal. Eventually, I just stopped bringing it up. I'd hand over my paycheck without a word, keep my head down, and go back to work. I was basically working for nothing, and every shift felt heavier, knowing that no matter how many hours I put in, I'd never get to see a cent of it. I kept telling myself, just a little longer, just hold on until you're 18. But it was rough. I was doing all the work, putting in all the hours, but getting absolutely nothing out of it. One time, I was so frustrated that I tried hiding a bit of cash. I figured maybe if I tucked away a small amount each week, they wouldn't notice. So I started stashing a little in an old book under my bed. I didn't know what I'd use it for, but I just wanted something, anything, that was mine. I kept it hidden for a couple of weeks, adding a few bucks here and there. But then, one day, I came home, and my dad was waiting for me with that book in his hand. He'd found the money. He didn't yell. He didn't even look mad. Instead, he looked at me with this smug expression and said, "You think you're smart, don't you?" Then he took every dollar I'd hidden and walked out without another word. I felt crushed. That little stash was the only bit of freedom I thought I had, and just like that, it was gone. It was like he needed to remind me that no matter what I did, he'd always be in control. After that, I gave up on saving. I was tired of fighting for scraps, tired of the constant surveillance, tired of being treated like my only worth was what I could hand over. I just kept my head down, did my shifts, and handed over the paychecks without a word. I was counting the days until I'd be free, but every day felt longer than the last. The job that was supposed to give me independence became another chain, another thing my dad controlled. And all I could do was wait, hoping that one day I'd finally get to keep what I'd worked so hard to earn. Turning 18 felt like I'd finally reached the finish line of a marathon I'd been running my whole life. For years, I'd been telling myself that once I hit that age, I'd be out of my parents' house for good, and now it was actually happening. I'd been working nonstop, putting in hours at that grocery store, dealing with my dad taking my money, and watching every penny slip out of my hands. But now, I had enough saved to finally make my move. I'd scraped together just enough for a down payment on a tiny, run-down room that was far from luxurious. But it was my own. I wasn't picky, I just wanted out. Packing up my things was weirdly satisfying. My parents didn't think much of it at first. They figured I'd stay forever, too afraid to leave their grip. But when they realized I was serious about moving, my dad had this look like he couldn't believe it. And my mom? She just stood there, saying something like, "You think you're ready to be on your own?" But her voice wasn't worried or caring. It was more like she was hoping I'd fail so I'd come crawling back. The night before I left, my dad called me into the living room. He put on his serious face and started going on about how being out there would be hard and how I wasn't prepared. He kept hammering in that I'd never make it on my own and that I'd be back in no time. It was his way of trying to plant doubt, make me second-guess myself. And honestly, a part of me was scared. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but staying felt even worse. The next morning, I got up, threw my bag over my shoulder, and walked out without looking back. It felt surreal. I didn't even care that my place was just a small, drafty room in an old house. It was mine, and that's all that mattered. I remember sitting down on the bed and looking around, and even though there was nothing in there but a mattress and an old dresser, I felt a freedom I'd never known. No one was going to tell me what to do or take my money anymore. Life on my own started out pretty rough. I was broke, barely scraping by. My room didn't come with much. No fancy furniture, no fridge, just a sink in the corner, and a hot plate I bought secondhand. My meals were whatever I could afford, usually ramen or canned stuff, but I didn't care. I could finally make decisions for myself, even if that meant learning how to budget and plan meals. I wasn't working just to hand it all over anymore, and that alone made everything worth it. One of the first things I did was enroll in college. I hadn't thought much about my future beyond getting away from my parents, but now that I was out, I wanted more. I applied for financial aid, took out some loans, and signed up for classes. I went for business administration, figuring it would open up doors for me later on. It wasn't some dream program, but it felt like a step forward, like I was finally building something of my own. Balancing college with work was no joke. My shifts at the grocery store were still long, and I'd have to squeeze in study sessions between shifts. Most nights, I'd come home exhausted, but there was this sense of purpose I'd never felt before. I wasn't just existing or surviving under someone else's control. I was working for something, building a future that was mine. And even though the struggle was real, that thought kept me going. After a while, I started to make friends at school. It was the first time I had people around me who actually respected me, not people waiting to judge me or control my every move. I didn't have to keep looking over my shoulder, wondering what my dad would say or how my mom would react. I could just be myself, and they accepted me for that. It was a small thing, but it felt huge, like I was finally becoming my own person. Every once in a while, I'd get a message from my mom or a check-in from my dad, mostly just them fishing for info about how I was doing. I knew they wanted me to fail, to hear that I was struggling so they could swoop in and say, "See? We told you so." But I kept it vague, didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing anything about my life. I wasn't about to give them any ammo to use against me. Eventually, I got a job waiting tables at a nicer place and the pay was better. I left the grocery store and threw myself into balancing my new job with college. The restaurant job was exhausting, but also kind of rewarding. I was picking up skills, learning how to handle different kinds of people, and saving up a little bit more each month. For the first time, I could actually think about things like upgrading my room or buying decent clothes without feeling like I was about to lose everything. It was slow progress, but it felt good. My routine was intense. Classes in the morning, work in the afternoon, and studying late into the night. There were nights I'd crash into bed, barely able to keep my eyes open, but it felt like I was finally living. I didn't have anyone telling me what to do, and I was free to mess up, learn from it, and grow. I'd never had that freedom before, and I wasn't about to take it for granted. One day, after saving for months, I was able to move into a slightly better place. It was still nothing fancy, just a small studio, but it had a real kitchen, a bathroom, and enough space to fit a couch and a small table. When I moved in, it was like this weight lifted off my shoulders. I'd done this all by myself, and it was proof that I didn't need my parents' help or permission to survive. As time went on, I started doing better in my classes too. Without all the stress from my home life, I could actually focus, and my grades were decent. I never thought of myself as particularly smart, but I was determined, and that was enough to keep me going. I found myself actually enjoying some of the subjects like marketing and management. It was like my whole life had been on pause, and now I was finally pressing play. I'd go back to my tiny studio after a long day and feel proud, knowing I was making it on my own terms. It was far from easy, but I was living a life that was mine. No one was telling me where to go or what to do, and every little victory, like acing a test or saving up for a new piece of furniture, felt like a win. It was the life I dreamed about all those years, and I was finally living it. So, yeah, it was tough. Money was tight, and I was always exhausted, but I'd take that any day over living in my parents' house again. Getting out and finally finding myself felt like escaping a prison I'd been locked in my whole life. And for the first time, I felt like I could actually be happy. Things were finally starting to come together for me. I had my own place, I was doing all right at school, and I was making enough to keep myself afloat. My life felt like it was finally mine, and every little success reminded me that getting out of my parents' house was the best decision I'd ever made. I was done with them, or so I thought. One day after a long shift, I came home to find a small package sitting outside my door. There was no return address and I wasn't expecting anything, so I was a bit curious. I opened it up and found a thick envelope inside. I figured maybe it was some paperwork from my college or job, but when I saw who it was from, my heart sank a bit. It was from my dad. Now, my parents hadn't exactly been blowing up my phone since I'd left. They'd occasionally text or try to call, mostly to ask me pointless questions or guilt-trip me into coming over for family stuff. But I'd kept things short and sweet, never really giving them any insight into my life. So, seeing a whole envelope from them was odd. I opened it up, and inside was a letter from my dad, along with a bunch of paperwork. I started reading the letter, and with every line, I felt my stomach drop further and further. Basically, the letter said that my dad had taken out a huge loan a few years back to start some business venture. Long story short, the whole thing had flopped. Badly. Now he was drowning in debt and needed my help to fix it. But that wasn't even the worst part. Along with the letter was a copy of the loan statement, showing just how much he owed. And the number wasn't small, it was massive. I'm talking years of payments, interest piling up, and no clear way out. My dad's note made it sound like he was just casually passing this off to me, as if it was somehow my responsibility to help him out because family sticks together. The entire thing felt surreal. I'd worked so hard to get away from them, to build something for myself, and now they were just expecting me to swoop in and save the day. I felt this mix of anger and betrayal, like they'd just thrown their mess onto my doorstep without a second thought. I remember sitting there staring at the loan paperwork, trying to wrap my head around it. It wasn't like they were asking for a small loan or a one-time payment. No, this was them saying, "Hey, you're doing well now, so why don't you take over this huge debt we can't manage?" My dad actually wrote that it wouldn't be too much of a burden on me since I was making a decent income now. I mean, how entitled can you get? I decided I wasn't just going to ignore this. I needed answers. So I called my dad, trying to keep calm, and asked him point blank what this was all about. Right away, he went into this speech about how he'd always believed in me and knew I'd make something of myself, and now it was time for me to help out the family. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This guy, who'd taken every cent I earned in high school and never gave me a dime for college, was suddenly acting like I owed him my success. I told him I'd worked for everything on my own and that this loan was his responsibility, not mine. But he just brushed that off, saying, "You wouldn't be where you are if it weren't for me." He actually had the nerve to say that my independence, my job, my entire life, all of it was somehow thanks to him. My mom chimed in too, trying to guilt trip me about how hard things had been for them lately. She said that since I was doing so well, it was only fair that I step up and help. She went on and on about family duty, how they'd done so much for me over the years. It was insane. They really thought they could just dump this all on me, like I owed them some huge debt for the privilege of growing up in their house. I asked my dad what exactly he'd been doing that got him into this mess, and he finally admitted it was some half-baked scheme to start a business. He thought he'd found the next big thing and poured everything into it, only for it to tank almost immediately. He never told me about it, never asked for advice or help when it first went south. But now that the debt was piled up, suddenly it was my problem. Then, just to twist the knife a bit more, he told me that my situation made me the only one who could take on this responsibility. He knew I was doing okay for myself, and I guess in his mind, that made me his fallback plan. Like because I'd escaped their control, I'd somehow earned the honor of paying off his screw-up. I was so angry I could barely keep my voice steady. I told him that this wasn't my responsibility and that I didn't owe them anything. I'd built my life on my own, without a single ounce of help from them. But my dad just laughed, saying I'd come around eventually, like this was some phase I'd grow out of. I ended the call feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Here I was working hard, barely keeping myself afloat, and they thought I could just magically pay off a mountain of debt because it was the family thing to do. I couldn't believe they had the audacity to even ask. It felt like they hadn't just crossed a line, they'd obliterated it. For a few days I just tried to shake it off, but it kept eating at me. I kept thinking about how entitled they were, how they thought I'd put my life on hold to clean up their mess. It was like they saw me as this backup plan, like I was there to bail them out whenever they screwed up. The more I thought about it, the angrier I got. This wasn't just a one-time mistake. They actually believed they deserved my help, no matter what they'd done to me over the years. After about a week, I decided to send them a response. I wrote a letter, as blunt as I could, explaining that their loan wasn't my problem and that I wouldn't be helping them out. I reminded them that they'd never supported me, never gave me a dime for school or rent, and that I was done letting them guilt trip me. I made it clear that this was the last time I'd entertain their requests for money, and that they'd have to figure out their own way out of this mess. The day they got the letter, my dad called me up furious. He ranted about how I was ungrateful and how he'd raised me better than this. He kept saying I was turning my back on the family, but I didn't care anymore. I'd done enough, put up with enough, and I wasn't going to let them drag me down with them. Hanging up that call felt like ripping off a Band-Aid. I was done with their guilt trips, their manipulation, and their entitlement. For once, I was putting myself first, and it felt damn good. After that last call, I knew it was over. I didn't need any more guilt trips or manipulative family talks from them. It was time to cut them off for good. I had held out for years, hoping for maybe a shred of support or acknowledgement, but this whole loan fiasco made it clear. They only saw me as some backup plan, someone they could use when things went sideways. I wasn't a person to them. I was just a bank with a pulse. For the next few weeks, I kept my phone on silent and let their messages pile up. They'd call, leave voicemails, text, sometimes both of them, sometimes just my mom, trying to reason with me. Each message was the same thing. Reminders of family obligations and warnings that I'd regret it if I didn't step up. My dad would say stuff like, "Family is all we've got," and "We raised you better than this." It was like they were reading from some script, as if repeating the same phrases would somehow make me give in. At first, I'd get this gut reaction every time I saw one of their messages pop up, like a spike of guilt or anger. Years of conditioning, I guess. But after a while, the messages just turned into background noise. I'd see them, ignore them, and go about my day. It was weirdly freeing. For once, I wasn't feeling obligated to respond or explain myself. I was finally learning how to not care. But of course, they didn't let up. My dad escalated like I knew he would. He left me a voicemail saying he'd be forced to take drastic measures if I didn't answer. I deleted it. Then he tried sending a letter, saying that he'd reach out to my friends or people at work if he had to. That one got under my skin a bit, but I reminded myself it was just more of his scare tactics. He was bluffing, trying to mess with me like he always had. It wasn't just the direct messages either. My mom started pulling the worried mother act, reaching out to my siblings to ask them if they'd heard from me, saying she was worried sick. They knew the drill, though. My brother, who'd been fed up with them for years, was the first to call me up and tell me to ignore her. He said, "She's only worried now because she can't control you." That pretty much summed it up. My parents were never worried about me, just about what I could do for them. After a while, I realized the only way to truly get rid of their influence was to make it official. So I filed for a restraining order. I didn't want to do it, but it felt like the only way to get them to back off permanently. I'd saved every single one of their guilt-trippy messages and threats, and it was more than enough to get the order approved. When I got the notification, it was like this huge weight had been lifted. They couldn't just invade my life whenever they felt like it anymore. The fallout was interesting. My dad was furious, of course. The last message I got from him was him calling me ungrateful and saying I was turning my back on my own family. But I'd heard it all before. By this point, their words didn't hold any power over me. I'd spent my whole life being controlled, and now I was finally free of it. Going no contact was weird at first. I'd grown up so used to them constantly in my ear, constantly telling me what I could or couldn't do, that silence felt strange. But it was also the most peaceful silence I'd ever felt. For the first time, I wasn't living with that constant knot of anxiety in my stomach, waiting for the next shoe to drop, the next lecture, the next demand. I could actually focus on my own life without their shadow hanging over me. Little by little, I started finding more of myself too. Without my parents' constant interference, I could finally make my own choices without feeling guilty or second-guessing everything. I started putting energy into things that actually mattered to me, like my classes, my job, and just building a life that was actually mine. The freedom felt strange at first, almost like it was something I didn't quite know how to use. But day by day, I started to feel like a real person, not just some tool or resource for my parents to use. Of course, going no contact wasn't something everyone understood. I had friends who thought I was taking things too far, or who didn't quite get why I couldn't just make peace with my parents. They'd say things like, "But they're your family," or maybe they didn't mean it like that. I'd just nod and let them talk because they didn't know the half of it. Most people had no idea what it was like to live under a dictatorship disguised as a family, where every part of your life was up for grabs if it benefited them. Once, I even had a coworker tell me to just forgive and forget. I remember just looking at him, thinking, if only you knew. People who have supportive families will never understand what it's like when the people who are supposed to protect you are the same people who constantly break you down. I wasn't bitter. I was just done. As more time passed, the peace I felt started to grow into something I didn't expect. Confidence. Cutting my parents off had forced me to finally trust myself, to rely on my own judgment without someone breathing down my neck. I started making choices based on what I wanted, not on what anyone else expected of me. I could save money, plan trips, invest in myself, all things that would have been impossible under their thumb. Every now and then, I get a ping of worry, wondering if they find a way to come back and disrupt my life. But then I'd remind myself that I'd taken steps to protect myself and that I'd stood my ground. They couldn't touch me anymore, and for the first time, I felt safe in my own life. I look back now, and I don't regret a thing. Going no contact wasn't easy, but it was necessary. My parents had always been takers, always looking for what they could get from me, never considering what I needed. In their eyes, family was just another way of saying obligation. But for me, family is supposed to be about support, trust, and respect, things they never gave me. Cutting them off wasn't about revenge or getting even. It was about survival, about choosing myself for once, instead of constantly sacrificing my well-being for people who didn't care. It took a long time, but I finally learned that I didn't owe them anything. They were the ones who chose to make me a pawn in their game, and I chose to stop playing. So here I am, building my life the way I want, without their interference. And I can honestly say I'm happier and stronger because of it. I know there will always be people who don't understand, who will say things like, "But they're your parents." But they weren't parents to me, not in any way that counts. And I finally know that I deserve better.